There are families in which the middle child grows wild in rebellion, loud in defiance, forever clamoring for the attention denied to her. Eleanor Whitcomb was not that sort of middle child. Where others shouted, she learned to observe. Where others demanded, she learned to endure. London would later say that this was her first and greatest mistake. The city mistook her silence for absence. She had grown up between two blazing stars. Lady Charlotte, the eldest, had been proclaimed a diamond of the first water before she was 19. Her beauty filled rooms, her laughter stitched conversations together. She had married Lord Norwood, a man whose name was followed by the soft, reverent phrase, heir to considerable estates, almost as faithfully as it was followed by his shadow. People said Charlotte's future shone as brightly as the Norwood silver displayed in their drawing room. They were not wrong. Lady Margaret, the youngest, had never needed to be told the world would indulge her. She discovered it early and wielded that knowledge like a fan, fluttering open and closed with light cruelty. At 18, she had become the cherished wife of Lord Hadley, a man whose influence made parliamentary votes lean where he wished, and private doors open when they ought to remain shut. When Margaret entered a room, she did so as though the floor had been laid for her feet alone. And Eleanor, placed between Norwood's respectability and Hadley's influence, possessed something society admired only in the abstract, an impeccable reputation. She was never seen in a compromising position. Her gowns were always tasteful, never ostentatious. Her conversations, when they were drawn out of her, were measured, informed, and respectful. She neither blushed foolishly nor flirted beyond what was proper. She danced as custom required, smiled when addressed, listened more than she spoke. It ought to have been enough. It was not. Year after year, season after glittering, exhausting season, the same realization echoed through drawing rooms and opera boxes whenever Eleanor's name arose. Educated people agreed, so very serious, they murmured, a trifle, mature, some added delicately, as though kindness required them to soften the blow. While gentlemen sought freshness and giggles and the trifling thrill of conquering a silly heart, Eleanor Whitcomb offered composure, and the sense that she understood the world far too well to be easily dazzled by it. Suitors came, but lightly. They admired her conversation, compared her favorably to some flightier cousin or acquaintance, and then, without quite knowing why, turned their earnest attentions elsewhere. They asked Charlotte for introductions, Margaret for dances, and Eleanor for opinions. It was in its own way a peculiar form of exile. Pity followed. The first few seasons, it was hidden behind polite smiles and the determined optimism of matchmaking mammas. "She has such a lovely figure," they would say, as though speaking loudly enough might conjure an enamored earl from thin air. And those eyes. Mark my words, Lady Whitcomb, it is only a matter of time. But time, as it is wont to do, grew tired of being threatened. By Eleanor's fourth season, the tone had shifted. Pity had deepened into something almost comfortable. People rehearsed it, perfected it, polished it the way they polished compliments. A smile of faint sorrow here, a soft squeeze of the hand there, a wondering comment at how cruelly blind gentlemen could be to true worth, all directed at Eleanor and never at those who failed to see her. She became, in the quiet ledger society keeps in its collective mind, a woman to be pitied but not pursued, harmless, useful, dependable. The sort of guest who filled a vacant seat at dinner, balanced the numbers at a ball, and could be relied upon not to scandalize or disappoint. No one expects very much of the middle child who does not complain, until, of course, something cracks. The first cracks in London's complacency appeared in the form of whispers. They began, as such whispers often do, in the corner of a drawing room late in the afternoon, when the tea was nearly gone and the sunlight had turned thin and cold. "Have you heard," someone asked, "about Harrowgate?" The name carried weight, even spoken softly. Alexander Hastings, Duke of Harrowgate, had been more myth than man for the better part of 4 years. Once his presence had been as inevitable as the Prince Regent's at any notable function. He had danced rarely but flawlessly, broken hearts without appearing to notice, and played politics with the unhurried assurance of a man who knew precisely how far his influence stretched. Then his wife died. No one agreed precisely on the manner of it. Some said illness, speaking of a wasting sickness that had shrunk the Duchess to a shadow of herself. Others leaned closer and whispered of a riding accident, a broken neck, a scream that had never quite finished, silenced by an impact no one had time to prevent. The most imaginative lowered their voices further still and hinted at things best left to Gothic novels, locked rooms and unspoken resentments, and the sort of arguments that leave more scars than bruises. What was certain was this. From the day of her death, the Duke of Harrogate had withdrawn. He ceased to attend balls. He declined invitations to dinners, country house parties, card evenings. He appeared only when duty compelled him, at sessions of the Lords, at the occasional political consultation, or in the sombre pew of his family chapel on Sundays. London, which thrives on spectacle, was offended by his refusal to provide it. Rumours, deprived of his visible presence, grew fat on speculation. He will never marry again, some declared. He adored her. He is half a ghost himself. On the contrary, others argued, he is merely waiting. Mark my words, he will choose with extraordinary care. Men do not forget the lesson of a first misstep. A man like Harrogate cannot remain alone, the practical insisted. There are estates to consider, an heir to be begotten. Titles do not persist on grief. Yet no woman, no matter how well-born or well-favoured, could claim to have danced with him, conversed with him, or drawn even a passing flirtatious glance since his withdrawal. He was an absence heavily outlined. Which is why when the winter brought with it the Davenports' grand ball, no one expected his name to be whispered at all, much less entwined with that of Eleanor Whitcomb. The morning of the ball began like any other in the Whitcomb household, with a flurry of servants and the rustle of silk. Charlotte visited, as was her habit, with her usual cloud of confidence, and Norwood's carriage waiting at the curb as though the street itself belonged to them. Margaret arrived later, fragrant with a new perfume, and an airy disdain for the idea of winter balls at all. "You know the only reason they choose December," she declared, removing her gloves with the sort of dramatic flair some women reserved for fainting fits, "is because everyone is so wretchedly bored by now they will accept any excuse for amusement. We are like children, shrieking at the sight of a new toy." "You shrieked at the sight of that necklace Hadley gave you," Charlotte observed mildly. "Do not pretend you did not." Margaret's hand flew to her throat at once, fingers brushing the delicate chain there. "That was not a shriek," she protested. "It was a perfectly dignified gasp. There is a great difference." Eleanor, at her dressing table, allowed herself a small smile. Their older sister's teasing, Margaret's indignation. It all unfolded with the inevitability of a well-rehearsed play. She could almost forget for a moment that she herself had not been granted such predictable lines in the script of her own life. "You will come with us this evening?" Charlotte asked, turning at last to Eleanor with the gentle insistence of a woman accustomed to being obeyed. "Norwood assures me the guest list is beyond reproach. Lady Davenport has been very careful to ensure every titled gentleman with even a passing acquaintance with a dance floor will be present," Margaret corrected. "Lady Davenport measures respectability by acreage and annual income. But yes, Nell, you must come. You did not go to the Cotterills musicale and Mamma has not forgiven you." Eleanor's reflection met her own eyes in the glass. They were steady eyes, grey like a winter sea, giving away less than they saw. "I will go," she said. Margaret exhaled, relieved. "Good. I refuse to spend another evening watching you play the martyr by the fire while we freeze in draughty ballrooms without you." It was almost kind in Margaret's way. Eleanor did not point out that her absence from such events neither prevented her sister's enjoyment nor increased it. She simply turned slightly so Charlotte's maid could finish arranging her dark hair, smoothing it into an elegant style that conceded nothing to passing fashions. Hours later, when the lamps were lit and the sky outside their windows had turned to black glass, Eleanor stood again at the threshold of yet another ball. Not the Davenport ballroom yet, but the threshold between decision and consequence. Her gloves were buttoned, her shawl draped over her shoulders, her mother's soft instructions still lingering in the air. "Remember, dearest, the Davenports are old friends. You will be noticed, and if any gentleman at all, should ask you to dance twice, do not refuse him." The old ache stirred then, the one that crept in whenever such hopes were hung around her neck like invisible jewels. Eleanor swallowed it quietly. "I will remember, Mama." And then Charlotte, already half wrapped in her cloak, turned suddenly back. For once, something like anxiety had carved a faint line between her brows. "Eleanor," she said, voice dropping, "do not go to the ball alone again." The words threaded through the quiet of the hall, catching Eleanor by surprise. She blinked. "I did not intend to," she began, glancing toward the door where Norwood's carriage waited. "I thought—" "I mean," Charlotte interrupted, stepping closer, "not alone in the way you are always alone, standing by walls, sitting near doors, pretending you are content to be invisible. You are not invisible to us, but to them." She trailed off, searching her sister's face. "Do not let them make you feel coarse spare." It was the most direct acknowledgement Charlotte had ever given of Eleanor's quiet exile. For a heartbeat, Eleanor did not trust herself to speak. The temptation to answer with something earnest, something raw, something that might not fit neatly into the safe, polished spaces of their lives, rose and then fell again. "You worry too much," she said instead, smoothing an imaginary wrinkle from her glove. "There is nothing so tragic as all that in a woman who prefers corners." Charlotte's eyes softened. "You do not prefer them. You settle for them." Before Eleanor could reply, a commotion sounded outside. The clatter of wheels, the muffled shout of a driver, the crunch of tires over frost-hardened ground. Norwood's carriage, Eleanor thought automatically. Perhaps Hadley's. The houses on their street were accustomed to expensive vehicles coming and going, but this sound was different. It settled uneasily under the skin, like a chord struck slightly off true. Margaret, always drawn to the possibility of spectacle, darted toward the window. "What on earth?" She stopped. "Charlotte," she breathed, "come here. You must see this." Charlotte crossed the room, skirts whispering over the polished floor. Their mother, curiosity overcoming decorum, followed more slowly. Eleanor remained where she was, suspended in the center of the hall, the weight of her sister's admonition still hanging between them. Do not go to the ball alone again. Her every instinct, honed by years of being overlooked, urged her not to step nearer to anything that might resemble attention. She was a woman who knew how to survive evenings by slipping into the spaces people overlooked. It had become a habit, as unconscious as breathing. Yet silence, as London would soon learn, is not the same as emptiness. "Eleanor," her mother called, voice oddly strained, "come here at once." Eleanor obeyed. The sight waiting for her at the window did not belong to the gentle, familiar world of their quiet street. A carriage had drawn up before their door, black as midnight, its lacquer gleaming even in the weak winter light from the street lamps. The horses were perfectly matched, their coats dark, their breath fogging the air in pale ghosts. The harnesses shone, the fittings precise. Upon the carriage door, picked out in impeccable gold, was a crest, a hawk in flight above a stylized H, the Hastings crest. For a moment, the room seemed to contract. Eleanor heard the soft sound of her mother's breath leaving her lungs. "That cannot be," Margaret whispered, fingers tightening on the curtain. "Harrogate does not call on anyone. He sends agents, solicitors. He does not appear. He is—" "A widower," Charlotte finished quietly. As though the word itself might summon him, the carriage door opened. The man who stepped down into the cold December air was indeed a widower, but that was hardly the first impression. He was tall, his shoulders filling the severe lines of his black coat, with an ease that spoke of strength rather than mere height. His hair, dark as his carriage, was cut with a soldier's practicality rather than a courtier's vanity. Even at this distance, the set of his jaw was clear, firm, contained, unwilling to yield more of himself than he chose. He did not look up at their window. He did not need to. The air itself seemed to shift around his presence, as though acknowledging the space power makes in the world. "Alexander Hastings," Charlotte said under her breath almost to herself. "The Duke of Harrogate." The name hung there, hovered, and then, like all names when attached to living men instead of whispered rumors, settled into the room with disquieting reality. A knock sounded at their door. It was brisk, decisive. Their butler, Jenkins, was a man who prided himself on being unruffled by anything short of a house fire. Even he seemed momentarily unsettled as he moved past the women to answer. His hand, Eleanor noted absently, adjusted his cravat once before he opened the door, an unconscious gesture of respect. The door swung inward. "Your Grace," Jenkins said, with a bow deeper than Eleanor had ever seen him offer. Eleanor's heart, which had been so disciplined for so long, misstepped. The Duke crossed the threshold as though he had done so 100 times rather than never at all. He was not in mourning black, but his coat was dark enough to deny any warning frivolity. His eyes, when they lifted to take in the small gathering in the hall, were a striking, unsettling blue, cold in color perhaps, but not empty. No, there was nothing empty about Alexander Hastings. Instead, there was a sense of something contained, like a storm behind glass. "Lady Whitcomb," he said, bowing to Eleanor's mother with formal precision, "forgive the intrusion." "Your Grace," her mother managed, curtsying with automatic grace, "we are surprised to see you." Surprised was a thin word for it. London would have called it a miracle or an omen. "I imagine you are," he replied. His voice was low, the sort that did not need to be raised to be heard. "I would not come without cause." Charlotte and Margaret each dipped in elegant curtsies. He acknowledged them with a polite inclination of his head, nothing more. His gaze moved beyond them, past their beauty, past their poised expectation. It settled on Eleanor. She had the strangest sensation that the world narrowed to the space between his eyes and hers. For an instant, she wondered if he saw her, or merely the outline of the role he had come here to fill. "Lady Eleanor," he said. Until that moment, she was not entirely certain he knew her name. They had never been introduced. Their circles had brushed alongside one another during her earliest seasons, when he was still a regular presence in London drawing rooms, but there had never been occasion for more than a distant glance. Now, he spoke her name with unhurried clarity, as though ensuring it fit properly in his mouth. "Your Grace," she answered, dipping in a curtsy that was deeper than she would offer a lesser man, but no more deferential than custom required. "Forgive the urgency of my call." His gaze did not waver. "I understand you are to attend the Davenports' ball this evening." Eleanor's mother made a faint sound that might have been agreement. Eleanor herself inclined her head. "I am, Your Grace." "If you will permit it," he said, as calmly as though suggesting an afternoon drive. "My carriage will convey you there. I shall escort you." There was a moment of complete, ringing silence. Eleanor felt it in her bones, the collective intake of breath, the way even the candle flames seemed to pause. The world outside went on, no doubt. Somewhere a fishmonger shouted, a child laughed, a door slammed. But in that hall, existence narrowed to the impossibility of his words. Charlotte found her voice first. "Your Grace," she began, her tone carefully composed. "This is generous. But surely Lady Eleanor would not wish to inconvenience—" "It is no inconvenience," Harrogate said, the faintest edge of steel slipping beneath the courteous surface of his tone. "I am attending the ball. My carriage has room. London, Lady Charlotte, has grown complacent in its assumptions of who will and will not appear where. It is past time something unsettled that complacency." His words, though general, landed with unnerving precision. Eleanor understood with the clarity of a woman who has spent years listening from corners that this was not simply about transport. This was theatre. Not for his sake. He did not strike her as a man who sought attention for its own sake, but for some purpose she could not yet see. It would be so easy to refuse. She could demur, claim discomfort, plead a headache that would conveniently sharpen just as the hour of the ball approached. She could slide once more into the safe obscurity of being the woman no one expected anything remarkable from. The familiar corners awaited her, forgiving, but Charlotte's earlier words still pressed against her mind. "Do not go to the ball alone again." Eleanor looked at the Duke, truly looked, at the small lines at the corners of his eyes that did not come from laughter, at the way his jaw remained controlled, even when surprise or impatience might have justified a break in composure, at the way his gloved hands were perfectly still at his sides, as though he had long ago mastered the art of never revealing a tremor. This was a man accustomed to managing the expectations of others. Tonight, for reasons she did not yet grasp, He had decided to involve her in that management. "Your Grace," she said, her own voice sounding steadier than she felt. "I would be honored." A flicker, something like approval or perhaps relief, passed through his eyes. "Then it is settled." He turned to her mother, offering the polite reassurance of a man who knew exactly how much unease he was causing. "You have my word, Lady Whitcomb, that your daughter will be treated with every respect due her. And," he added, with a faint curve to his mouth that stopped short of a true smile, "I will return her to you at a reasonable hour. Scandal does not require lateness to thrive." Her mother, who understood all too well what scandal could do to a household, managed a small laugh at that. It sounded brittle, but it was laughter nonetheless. "Of course, Your Grace," she said. "We are honored by your notice." Honored, terrified, bewildered. The words swirled beneath the ones she chose. Within 10 minutes, Eleanor found herself seated opposite the Duke of Harrogate in his carriage, the lamplight catching the polished surfaces around them, and the world outside reduced to shifting patterns of shadow and frost. It was not the first carriage ride of her life, but it was the first in which her solitude was so thoroughly broken. They travelled in silence for some minutes. It was not a heavy silence. Rather, it had the quality of something waiting to be shaped. Eleanor, remembering every story she had ever heard about the Duke's aloofness, did not rush to fill it. She knew, from long practice, the value of letting others speak first. At last, he did. "London believes it knows everything that matters about us," he said, his gaze fixed on the small window beside him. "It observes, it judges, it concludes. It is rarely correct." It took her a second to recognize that he had used the plural. "Us." "London has had 4 years to invent stories about you," Eleanor replied, surprised to hear her own voice enter the quiet. "Where there is absence, people are desperate to fill it." He looked at her then, properly. The full weight of his attention was not an easy thing to bear. It was not cruel, but it was penetrating, as though he were cataloguing the precise shape of her response. "And what stories has London told about you, Lady Eleanor?" he asked. "What absences has it filled on your behalf?" Most men she knew would have begun with pleasantries. They would have commented on the weather, the excitement of the evening, the beauty of the decorations they had not yet seen. Harrogate had leapt with unsettling directness to the heart of things. Eleanor could have answered with a deflection. She almost did. But the air in the carriage felt different from the suffocating politeness of most drawing rooms. His question was not idle. It was, she sensed, a test of some sort, not of her charm but of her willingness to see herself clearly. "They say," she began slowly, "that I am very proper, that I have a spotless reputation, that I am serious, perhaps too much so, that I am safe." "Safe," he repeated. The word in his mouth did not sound like a compliment. "Yes," she said, "safe to invite, safe to speak to, safe to stand beside. No one fears I will steal a husband or cause a scene. No one fears my presence will bring about anything unexpected at all. I have never given them a reason to." Something in his expression shifted, almost imperceptibly. "Do you regret that?" he asked. She considered. "I regret," she said after a moment, "that I allowed them to become so comfortable with my invisibility that they forgot to ask whether it suited me." The corner of his mouth lifted just slightly. "London," he said, "is about to discover that its comfort was premature." The statement sat between them like a small, quiet bomb. Eleanor felt curiosity uncurl inside her, bright and dangerous. "You intend to shock them," she said. "I intend," Harrogate replied, "to remind them that I am not an absence to be filled with their speculation, and that you are not furniture to be arranged where it offends no one." She caught her breath, a sharp, involuntary sound. He knew, perhaps not every detail of her past 4 seasons, but enough. Enough to see how easily she had been set aside in favor of women whose value society found easier to name. "Why me?" she asked before caution could stop her. "Why not choose a woman London already adores, someone whose arm at your side would be no surprise at all? There are any number of ladies who would consider it an extraordinary honor to be seen arriving with you." "I am aware," he said dryly, "but being predictable defeats the purpose." He paused, his gaze holding hers. "Lady Eleanor, do you believe yourself strong enough to endure being seen at my side?" It was a strange question. Not, "Are you willing?" Not, "Do you wish it?" But, "Are you strong enough?" "What is it you expect will happen?" she asked quietly. "Whispers," he said. "Speculation. Envy from some. Condescension from others. They will assign you motives you do not possess and deny you the ones you do. They will search your face for signs of ambition or desperation. Some will assume you have trapped me. To others that I am trifling with you. London does not like to be surprised. It resents those who remind it that it does not know everything." "You speak from experience," she observed. His eyes turned back to the window. "Yes." She thought of his late wife then, of the stories that swirled around a woman no longer alive to defend herself, of a marriage dissected by strangers, every gesture reinterpreted to support whatever narrative pleased the teller most. "It seems to me," Eleanor said slowly, "that London has already done its worst to you." "To me," he agreed, "not to you. I will not use you as a shield unless you understand that you will be struck as well." The honesty of it startled her. Men in their world almost never admitted the cost of their actions to the women around them. They expected wives, sisters, daughters to absorb whatever consequences fell their way as a matter of course. Yet here was a duke, one of the most powerful men in England, warning her plainly. "Why do you care?" she asked, "whether I am prepared?" For the first time, something unguarded passed over his features. It was gone almost as soon as it appeared, but she saw it. A flicker of memory, perhaps, or guilt. "Because I have already made one woman stand in the path of London's cruelty," he said. "I will not make that mistake again." Silence followed, but it felt different now. Less like emptiness, more like shared understanding. Eleanor did not press. Whatever details lay behind that admission belonged to another story, one that was not hers to demand. The carriage turned, the sound of wheels on cobblestones shifting as they neared a busier street. Through the small window, Eleanor caught the first distant glow of the Davenports' townhouse, ablaze with light. "I cannot promise," she said at last, "that their whispers will not wound. But I can promise I will not shatter because of them." He looked at her one final time before the night swallowed them both. "That," Alexander Hastings said quietly, "is precisely why I chose you." The Davenports' ballroom was already full when they arrived. Light spilled from the great chandeliers, scattering across polished floors and gilded mouldings. Music floated through the open doors, the violins laughing as brightly as the women beneath them. The air smelled of beeswax perfume, and the faint metallic anticipation that accompanies any gathering in which reputations can be made or unmade with a glance. Inside, no one was expecting the Duke of Harrogate. Oh, there were rumours, as there always were. Someone claimed to have seen his seal on a correspondence delivered to Lady Davenport last week. Another insisted they had caught a glimpse of his agent in deep conversation with Lord Davenport near the House of Lords. A few of the more reckless gossips had even suggested his mourning must be nearing its fashionable limit. Perhaps he would choose this evening to announce his return to society, but even those who speculated did not quite believe it. They said his name the way one invokes ghosts at midnight, half hoping, half fearing they might be answered, when the butler at the top of the stairs drew himself up and announced, in a voice that carried effortlessly across the ballroom, "His Grace, the Duke of Harrogate, accompanied by Lady Eleanor Whitcomb." The reaction was not a murmur or a polite ripple. It was a crack. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Fans stilled. The music, valiantly continuing for a few bars, faltered as one of the violinists turned his head and nearly missed his note altogether. Eleanor felt dozens, no hundreds of eyes turned toward her. The sensation was almost physical, like a sudden change in temperature against her skin. Beside her, Harrogate descended with unhurried steps, his hand steady on the railing. His other arm remained offered to her, solid and inevitable. She laid her gloved fingers lightly on his sleeve, as etiquette demanded, and forced her feet to follow his. Do not go to the ball alone again. Very well, she thought, as the crowd parted before them like the sea. No one could accuse her of that tonight. The Davenports themselves appeared at the foot of the stairs, their expressions schooled into what might have passed for calm to anyone who was not looking closely. Lady Davenport's colour had risen. Lord Davenport's hands were clasped a fraction more tightly than necessary behind his back. "Your Grace," Lady Davenport said, dropping into an elegant curtsy. "What an unexpected pleasure." "The pleasure is mine, Lady Davenport," Harrogate answered, bowing just enough to honour their hosts without surrendering an inch of his habitual reserve. "You host a splendid evening." "We are honoured by your presence," Lord Davenport added, recovering quickly. His gaze flickered politely to Eleanor. "And by yours, Lady Eleanor." "Lord Davenport." "Lady Davenport." Eleanor curtsied, her voice calm. If they were surprised to see her at Harrogate's side, they hid it better than most of the room. That did not mean she could not feel the question burning behind their composed expressions. Why her? She could feel the same question ricocheting through the assembled guests. Why her? The music resumed a trifle too loudly, as though the orchestra had suddenly remembered its duties and was overcompensating for its lapse. Conversation followed, trying to rearrange itself around the new centre of gravity that had just entered the room. Eleanor watched with the peculiar detachment that sometimes comes in moments of great personal upheaval as London recalculated. Young debutantes who had glanced over her in previous seasons with little more than mild curiosity now eyed her with a mixture of envy and suspicion. Their mammas clutched their dance cards a fraction tighter, minds racing through their mental ledgers of what such an unexpected alliance might mean. Married women measured her with more care, attempting to reconcile the Eleanor they thought they knew, the reliable, unremarkable middle sister, with the woman now standing at the Duke's side under the blazing chandeliers. Men watched too, some with rank and fortune enough to have once considered her a suitable, if uninspired, choice, others who had never spared her more than a polite nod. She could feel the tightening of their jaws, the faint flare of resentment, where once there had been only mild condescension. They had not wanted her, but they had wanted the option of her. Now, with the Duke of Harrogate's presence at her side, that option suddenly seemed less securely theirs. "Good evening, Harrogate." A voice, confident and edged with amusement, cut through the surrounding hum. Lord Hadley materialized, bowing with just enough deference to be proper and just enough ease to signal his importance. "London will explode by morning. You realize that, I trust." "Then I advise London to reinforce its foundations," Harrogate replied without missing a beat. Hadley's attention turned to Eleanor. There was a new sharpness in his gaze, one she had rarely seen there before. "Lady Eleanor," he said, taking her hand and bowing over it, "you astonish us all." "I had not realized my presence held such capacity," Eleanor answered. "I shall endeavour not to let the responsibility overwhelm me." Hadley's eyes narrowed slightly, then crinkled at the corners. For the first time since she had known him, she suspected he was seeing her clearly, rather than as an extension of his wife's family. "Touché," he murmured, releasing her hand. If Hadley's reaction contained humour, others did not. Her Viscount Eleanor recognized only vaguely from previous seasons approached, all smiles and strained charm. "Lady Eleanor," he exclaimed with practised warmth, "I had no idea you and His Grace were acquainted." "We are tonight," Harrogate said evenly. "That will suffice for the purposes of this ball." The Viscount laughed too loudly, then retreated with the quick step of a man unwilling to risk further missteps. Whispers resumed, less stunned now and more eager. Eleanor caught snatches as she and the Duke moved through the room. Widower or not, he could have chosen anyone. Always thought her too serious, but perhaps... Middle sister, isn't she? The one who never... Must be an arrangement. Nothing else explains. She let the words wash over her, noting their sting but refusing to let it sink deep. They did not know her. Not really. They had never bothered to. Harrogate, for his part, did not flinch. If he heard the whispers, he gave no sign. He guided her through the early formalities, greetings to the hosts, acknowledgements of key political figures, as though he had been escorting her for years. At length, the first set of country dances concluded. The Master of Ceremonies announced the next, inviting gentlemen to claim partners. Eleanor's hand hovered near her fan, more from habit than necessity. In previous seasons, this had been the moment when she would scan the room, gauging whether anyone who offered for her first dance might conceivably ask again. Hope and resignation had waged quiet wars in her chest. Tonight, she did not look around. She hardly needed to. "Lady Eleanor," Harrogate said, extending his hand, "may I request the honor of this dance?" There was nothing particularly intimate in his tone. The words themselves were as conventional as the curve of the chandeliers. But the gesture, public, deliberate, in full view of every curious, hungry eye in the ballroom, carried weight. "Yes, Your Grace," she replied, placing her hand in his. As they took their positions on the floor, a hush fell over the crowd again, subtler than the earlier shock, but no less intense. Men and women leaned forward, the way they might at the theatre when a long-anticipated scene began. The music started. Eleanor moved. She knew how to dance. Years of instruction had ensured that. But tonight, each step felt different, freighted with a new understanding of what it meant to occupy space in this world. She was no longer the woman content to edge along the margins of the dance floor, taking whatever scraps of attention came her way. The Duke's hand at her waist, the firm press of his fingers around her own, declared her presence as unmistakably as if he had rung a bell. "You are very composed," he murmured as they turned. "Most women would be trembling." "Perhaps I am," she said. "On the inside." "I doubt that," he answered. "You strike me as the sort of woman whose tremors, when they come, shake the foundations of things, not the surface." The compliment, or what passed for one from him, brought unexpected heat to her cheeks. "You have known me scarcely an hour," she pointed out. "You ascribe me great power for so brief an acquaintance." "The length of an acquaintance," he said, guiding her neatly past another couple, "is not the only measure of its depth." They moved through the figures, weaving in and out of lines, hands parting and rejoining. Once, as she spun away and back again, Eleanor caught sight of Charlotte and Margaret near the edge of the floor. Charlotte's expression was unreadable. Her fan held a fraction higher than usual. Margaret's eyes were wide, her lips parted in astonishment. Beside them, their mother pressed a hand to her throat, as though steadying the flutter beneath her skin. Eleanor wondered what this moment looked like to them. To Charlotte, who had begged her not to go to the ball alone again, did this feel like a prayer answered, or the beginning of a different kind of worry? To Margaret, who had always claimed the most remarkable things for herself without seeming effort, did Eleanor's sudden prominence feel like theft or revelation? She did not have the luxury of asking. As the dance progressed, the initial shock in the room began to change flavor. Surprise softened into curiosity. Curiosity in some cases hardened into resentment. Not everyone welcomed the disruption of their carefully arranged social expectations. Eleanor saw it in the coldness of some women's glances, in the tightness around certain men's mouths. She recognized those looks. She had seen their milder cousins directed at other women in other seasons, when some unexpected match or scandal had thrown plans into disarray. She knew, too, that this was only the beginning. When the dance ended, Harrogate bowed over her hand with the same measured courtesy he had shown throughout. "Thank you, Lady Eleanor," he said. "You danced beautifully." "Thank you, Your Grace," she replied. "You have given London an evening it will discuss for months." "Let them," he said. "Their tongues are their only exercise." The faintest smile tugged at her lips. "Cruel," she observed. "Accurate," he countered. As other gentlemen approached, some bold enough to request Eleanor's hand, now that Harrogate had publicly claimed the first dance, others hanging back, uncertain, Eleanor felt the shape of her life shifting beneath her feet, subtle but undeniable. This night was not simply the moment when a neglected middle sister found herself unexpectedly at the center of attention. It was the opening move in a game whose full contours she could not yet see. Beside her, composed and calculating, the Duke of Harrogate watched the room with the eye of a man accustomed to strategy. London thought it was watching him. It had not yet realized that he, and the woman at his side, were watching back. And somewhere, beneath all the glitter and music and whispered speculation, something older and deeper stirred. The first threads of a bond neither of them had come here seeking, and the first shadows of a truth he had sworn to bury. even if it meant using Eleanor Whitcomb as his shield. What he had not yet understood was this: Eleanor was no one's shield. She was a blade, quiet and underestimated, waiting for the moment to strike. If you ask London when a scandal truly begins, you will receive a variety of answers. Some will swear it starts with the first whisper, the first name dropped into conversation with a meaningful arch of the eyebrow. Others will say it begins with the first printed line in a gossip column, the first ink spilled in a satirical sketch. A few, more honest, will admit it begins the moment someone important feels their power shift beneath their feet. For Eleanor Whitcomb, the scandal began with a single choice in the Davenport's ballroom. After she danced with the Duke of Harrogate, every subsequent step she took that evening carried a new weight. Men asked her to dance who had never bothered before, not because they had suddenly discovered her charms, but because proximity to her might offer insight into the enigma at her side. "You must be overjoyed," one young baron said as he led her through a quadrille, his smile a fraction too wide. "Such an honor, Lady Eleanor. Harrogate has been quite reclusive." Overjoyed, as though her life had been an empty plate waiting for this one dish to be served. "It is an unexpected evening," she replied. "Joy remains to be measured." He blinked, unprepared for an answer that did not fit neatly into the script of gratitude he had anticipated. Harrogate watched. He did not hover. He was not the sort of man to orbit anyone, not even himself. But Eleanor was never far from his line of sight. When she danced with others, when she walked with Charlotte and Margaret to the refreshment table, when she stood near a tall window to catch a breath of air away from the crowd, she felt the faint, steady pressure of his attention like a distant hand at her back. It was not possessive. It was vigilant. "Do you feel like a curiosity?" Margaret asked in a low voice when they found a brief moment together near the side of the room. Margaret's cheeks were bright, her eyes glittering with a mixture of astonishment and something that might have been envy, though she would die before admitting it. "Like a painting newly hung," Eleanor said. "Everyone stops to stare for a moment and then decides whether they approve." Margaret snorted softly. "Oh, they do not approve," she said. "They are furious. Half the young women here would have sold their mothers to be the one on Harrogate's arm, and half their mothers would have gladly negotiated the price." "And you?" Eleanor asked, watching her. Margaret arched a brow. "I am married, Nell. I have already won my game, but do not mistake that for disinterest. Hadley is positively simmering with theories. He claims Harrogate rarely moves a piece on the board without 3 purposes in mind." "3," Eleanor repeated. "Not 2. "One is for show," Margaret said promptly. "One is for strategy, and one is for himself alone." Eleanor's gaze drifted almost involuntarily toward the Duke, who at that moment stood in quiet conversation with Lord Davenport and another older gentleman whose lined face spoke of long years in Parliament. His stance was relaxed, but the angle of his head suggested attention to every word. "Which purpose am I?" she murmured. Margaret followed her gaze, her expression sobering. "That," she said, "is what none of us know." They were not alone in their speculation. In a smaller salon off the main ballroom, a cluster of women gathered under the pretense of adjusting hairpins and cooling, flushed faces. The true temperature of the room, however, rose and fell with each name spoken. "Harrogate must be ready to remarry," one declared as she dabbed a drop of water at the corner of her eye, not to wipe away tears, but to ensure the light caught them prettily. He would not appear so publicly otherwise. "But Eleanor Whitcomb?" another asked, incredulous. "He could have any woman. Why one who has been overlooked for so many seasons? Perhaps he values virtue," a third suggested, the word rolling off her tongue with the faintest hint of mockery. "A spotless reputation is not something one finds in abundance these days." "Virtue is well enough," the second woman said, "but dukes do not marry merely for that. There must be something. A dowry? A political connection? Some debt between their families?" At the far end of the room, a woman older than the rest, Lady Ashton, whose memory was as long as her tongue, spoke up. "Do not underestimate a man's desire to surprise you," she said. "Harrogate has been spoken of as a ghost for 4 years. Ghosts grow weary of their own stories. Perhaps he simply chose the woman no one thought to watch." Laughter followed, but thin and uneasy. In another corner of the house, in a study temporarily turned into a card room, the men conducted their own dissection. "A calculated move," said Lord Redford, a politician whose opinions bore enough weight that people listened even when they wished not to. Aligning himself with a family like the Whitcombs, respectable, uncontroversial, gives him a shield. "A shield against what?" asked a younger man, shuffling cards with a little more vigor than precision. "Against the continued fascination with his grief," Redford replied. "If he is seen in the company of a woman beyond reproach, the whispers about his mourning will have to find a new target. London prefers its scandals with some promise of misbehavior. Lady Eleanor offers none." "You underestimate women," Hadley said mildly from his place at the table. "That one has more steel than you give her credit for." "Oh?" Redford raised a brow. "You know her well, Hadley." "I am married to her sister," Hadley replied. "I know what it means to live in proximity to underestimated women. It is rarely wise to forget they exist." Back in the ballroom, as the evening progressed, Eleanor began to feel the edges of herself clearer than she ever had before. The scrutiny, while exhausting, stripped away the last thin layer of pretense that had clung to her over the years. She could no longer imagine herself unnoticed. Neither could anyone else. During a lull between dances, Harrogate rejoined her near a pillar wreathed in winter greenery. The holly and ivy cast faint shadows across his face, lending him an almost severe air that did nothing to soften the sharpness of his features. "Are you tired?" he asked quietly. "A little," she admitted, "though not as much as people might have hoped." His mouth quirked. "You bear up under pressure," he said. "Good. Did you expect otherwise?" she asked, then realized the question might have sounded more vulnerable than she intended. "No," he said. "I chose you because I expected precisely this." The certainty in his tone warmed something in her chest that had been cold a very long time. Before she could respond, a new voice intruded. "Your Grace, Lady Eleanor." Eleanor turned to see a woman she recognized at once, though they had never been more than acquaintances. Lady Verity Sinclair. She was known in society for three things: beauty, wit, and a talent for gathering secrets like butterflies. "Lady Verity," Harrogate acknowledged with a courteous nod. "You are looking well." "Well is not the word I would choose," she replied, her gaze flicking between him and Eleanor with unabashed interest. "Electrified, perhaps. London has not had such a jolt in years." Eleanor inclined her head politely. "You are kind to elevate our small choices to the level of electricity, Lady Verity." "Oh, my dear," Verity said with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "There is nothing small about the choices of a duke, or the women he brings with him." The remark hovered on the fine line between compliment and barb. Eleanor felt its edges. "Then I hope," Eleanor said calmly, "that when London recovers from its shock, it will recall that I walked through these doors of my own will." Verity's eyes sharpened. "Of course," she said after a heartbeat. "I would expect nothing less from you." She moved on, leaving a faint trail of perfume and speculation in her wake. Harrogate watched her depart with a look Eleanor could not quite pass. "Be cautious with that one," he said. "She collects stories," Eleanor agreed, "but so do we all in our own way." "She sells hers," he countered, "not always for coin, sometimes for influence, sometimes for the pleasure of watching them ruin what others have built. She has held my name in her mouth before. I did not care for the taste it gave her." Something in his voice, a hint of old anger quickly leashed, made Eleanor's pulse quicken. "What did she say?" she asked. "Nothing original," he replied. "Nothing I had not already heard in a dozen drawing rooms, but she is efficient in disseminating what she hears. If there is a new story to be told about me, she will ensure it is told thoroughly." "About us," Eleanor corrected gently. His eyes met hers, assessing. "Yes," he said, "about us." The word hung between them, more intimate than any endearment could have been. The evening wore on. Near midnight, as the ball reached its glittering height, Lady Davenport, ever the careful hostess, arranged for a final waltz. Partners were chosen with an eagerness that barely pretended to be decorous. For many young women, this would be the last dance before weeks of quiet country visits. For some, the last dance before engagements were settled and futures sealed. Eleanor did not expect Harrogate to claim her again. He had made his statement. To do so twice would not simply cause comment, it would scream intent. So when he approached, stopping before her with the same calm composure he had worn all evening, Eleanor sensed the ground shift again. "Lady Eleanor," he said, extending his hand, "will you grant me this dance as well?" Conversation died in a wide circle around them. It was as though the entire room collectively held its breath. She knew the calculus playing out in dozens of minds. One dance might be dismissed as courtesy or theatrics. Two, especially the first and last of the evening, suggested something more deliberate. Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "Yes, Your Grace," she said. "I will." They moved together onto the floor. If the earlier country dances had felt like exercises in navigation, this waltz felt like stepping into a storm's eye. The music swept them in slow circles around the room, the rest of the world blurring at the edges. Eleanor was acutely aware of the warm, firm pressure of his hand at her back, the precise way his fingers closed around her own. Harrogate's movements were controlled, his steps sure. He did not require showy flourishes. His very restraint carried its own kind of power. "Do you regret agreeing to this?" he asked quietly partway through, his voice barely audible over the swell of the orchestra. "If you are asking whether I regret appearing with you," she said, "no. If you are asking whether I anticipated quite this much attention," she allowed herself a faint smile. "Also no." "And now that you have it?" he pressed. "Now that I have it," Eleanor said, "I find it less terrifying than I imagined. Partly because it is like standing under rain one feared would drown. Once you are wet, you realize you are still breathing." He looked at her, and something like admiration flickered across his face. "You were never meant for the shadows they pushed you into," he said. "And you?" she asked before she could stop herself. "Were you meant for exile?" He hesitated for a fraction of a beat. If she had not been watching his face so closely, she might have missed it. "No," he said. "But we do not always choose when we step out of the light, Lady Eleanor. Sometimes the door closes behind us before we are ready." "When your wife died," she said softly. The words were not a question, yet he answered them as though they were. "Yes." There it was. Not a full confession, not a detailed recitation, but an acknowledgement, a tether from the man he had been to the man he had become. "What made you open it again tonight?" she asked. He regarded her for a long moment, long enough that she felt the world narrowing to the space between their joined hands. "A promise," he said. "To whom?" she asked. His gaze lifted past her shoulder for a second, as if looking at something only he could see. "To a woman who is no longer here to hold me to it," he replied, "which makes the keeping of it all the more important." The music slowed, the final notes stretching like held breath. As the orchestra brought the waltz to its gentle conclusion, a murmur swelled around them, a wave of speculation not quite loud enough to break into words. Harrogate bowed over Eleanor's hand, his lips not quite touching her glove. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for stepping into this with me." "You speak," she replied, "as though I had a choice." "You did," he said, "and you chose." The truth of it settled over her like a cloak. They left the floor to a sea of glances. Some were assessing, some openly resentful, a few, very few, genuinely warm. Charlotte's eyes shone with a complicated mixture of pride and worry. Margaret looked as though she might explode if someone did not usher her to a sofa and feed her every detail. Lady Verity, standing near the doorway to the next room, watched them with the cool interest of a woman filing away every expression and gesture for later use. It was near 2 in the morning when Harrogate's carriage finally carried Eleanor back to the Whitcomb house. The chill outside had deepened. Frost rimed the bare branches of the trees lining the street, catching the lamplight like crystals. Inside the carriage, the air was warmer but no less charged. They sat for some moments in silence, each occupied by their own thoughts. "What kind of promise requires a public spectacle such as this?" Eleanor asked at last, unable to keep the question contained any longer. He did not pretend to misunderstand. "One made in desperation," he said. "On a night when I believed I was about to lose everything that mattered." "You spoke of your wife," she said, more gently than she had intended. Was it she who extracted this promise? In part, he replied. In part, it was extracted by my own conscience. He looked at her, his expression more open than she had seen it all evening. Do you recall a charity concert 8 years ago? He asked suddenly. A small event, poorly attended, held in a church off Hanover Square. Eleanor blinked. Of all the directions this conversation might have taken, this was not one she had anticipated. Yes, she said slowly. My mother insisted we perform. Charlotte played the harp. Margaret recited a poem, somewhat dramatically. I played the pianoforte. It raised very little money. But it was not entirely without effect, he said. My late wife attended. She preferred such modest affairs to the grand spectacles. She found sincerity easier to locate among the unimportant. Eleanor's mind shifted, turning over half-forgotten memories. I remember, she said slowly, surprised by the clarity that emerged. A lady in a dark blue gown, not very tall. She sat near the front and listened, as if every note mattered. We did not speak. You did, Harrogate said softly. Not then. Later. The words raised the hair on the back of Eleanor's neck. Later, she repeated. I do not recall. She sent for you, he said. Or rather, she sent for all three of you. To visit a small orphanage she supported in St. Giles. Do you remember that? The memory crashed into her then, sharp and vivid. The narrow streets, the smell of damp and coal smoke, the rows of thin faces watching them with solemn curiosity. Charlotte handing out sweets, her brightness dimmed by the surroundings. Margaret shrinking back a little from the dirt and noise. And a woman, the same one from the concert, moving among the children with a tenderness that seemed at odds with her fashionable gloves. She said, Eleanor whispered, that she wanted us to see the world outside our own drawing rooms, so that when we played and sang we would know for whom we might truly be playing. Harrogate's eyes held hers. My wife, he said, the Duchess of Harrogate. Eleanor swallowed. She never gave us her name. She rarely did, he said. She liked to be useful without being thanked. Eleanor's heart thudded in her chest. Why are you telling me this? She asked. Because, he said, my wife mentioned you often after that day. The carriage seemed to tilt. Me? Eleanor repeated, shaking her head. That cannot be. I said very little. Charlotte charmed everyone. Margaret provided drama. I merely played. Precisely, he replied. You listened more than you spoke. You watched. When one of the children began to cry, you did not call for the matron. You went to her yourself, sat on the floor so you would not tower over her, and let her finish before you tried to comfort her. My wife thought very highly of that. Heat rose to Eleanor's face, a mixture of surprise and grief, for a woman she had barely known, who had nonetheless carried a memory of her all these years. That was nothing, she protested weakly. To you, he said, not to my wife. Nor, I suspect, to the child. He exhaled as if bracing himself. On the last night of her life, he said quietly, my wife made me swear to do 3 things. To protect the orphanage we visited together, to carry forward certain reforms she had begun in the management of my estates, and to ensure that when the time came, Eleanor Whitcomb would not be devoured by this city. The world, which had been tilting, now seemed too empty of sound. She said my name, Eleanor whispered. Yes. In the midst of her and in the midst of dying, she thought of me. She thought, he said, of women like you. She named you because she had seen you. She recognized something in you the world had not yet discovered how to use or how to break. She believed London would either ignore you completely or, once it noticed you, attempt to consume you. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, absorbing this. Why would London wish to consume me? She asked. I am hardly so significant. Do not be so certain, Harrogate said. You are connected to more than you know. The words sent a prickle down her spine. In what way? She asked. He hesitated, his jaw tightening. That, he said slowly, is a longer story, and one I should not begin in a carriage outside your mother's house at 2 in the morning. The carriage had indeed come to a halt. Through the small window, Eleanor could see the familiar outline of her family's front steps. A lamp burned in the hall. Someone was awake. Her hand tightened slightly in her lap. "You speak as though my life has been moving towards something I have never been told," she said. "In some respects," he replied, "so has mine." He met her gaze directly. "Lady Eleanor, will you trust me enough to visit Harrogate House in 2 days' time? Not as the subject of gossip at a ball, but as a guest. There is something you must see, and there are truths I will not share anywhere else. There are moments when a woman stands at a crossroads and cannot know which path will define her life." Eleanor thought of her mother, sitting up with a book she would not read, ears straining for the sound of her daughter's return. She thought of Charlotte, warning her not to go to the ball alone in the way she always did. She thought of Margaret, hungry for drama, and of London, hungrier still. And she thought of the Duchess in her dark blue gown, sitting in that cold church, listening as if every note mattered. "Yes," Eleanor said, "I will come." A muscle in his jaw relaxed. "Good," he said. "I will send a formal invitation. Let London make of it what it will." As the footman opened the carriage door, cold air rushed in. Harrogate stepped out first, then turned and offered his hand to Eleanor. For a brief moment, standing there under the weak glow of the street lamp, her hand in his, Eleanor had the unshakable sense that she was stepping not merely onto her family's front walk, but into the heart of a story that had begun long before she was old enough to understand it. Inside, her mother, Charlotte, and Margaret were waiting. Her mother rose the instant Eleanor entered, her expression a battleground of emotions, relief, anxiety, calculation. "You are late," she said, then corrected herself at once. "Of course you are late. I cannot expect a ball of this magnitude to end at a reasonable hour. Were you seen?" Eleanor supplied gently. "Yes, Mama. I believe I was." Charlotte studied her face with a searching intensity. "Are you all right?" she asked. "Yes," Eleanor said. "Tired, overwhelmed, but yes." Margaret, more direct, burst out. "Did he say anything? Does he intend anything? Nell, you must tell us everything. Hadley says he would not have claimed you so openly if there were not some larger game at play, and I do not know whether to be delighted or offended on your behalf." "Margaret," their mother chastised weakly. "What?" Margaret demanded. "We have all been thinking it. I am merely unscrupulous enough to say it aloud." Eleanor removed her gloves slowly, buying herself a few seconds. "He intends," she said, "to disturb London's complacency. That much he has admitted." "And you?" Charlotte asked softly. "What do you intend?" Eleanor looked at her sisters, at her mother, at the life she had inhabited for so long, the familiar walls, the well-worn patterns of their days, safety of a sort, invisibility of another. "I intend," she said, feeling the truth of it form even as she spoke, "to stop waiting for the world to decide what I may be." Her mother's eyes filled with tears. "Eleanor," she whispered, "you must be careful. A man like Harrogate, his grief, his reputation, the stories—" "I know," Eleanor said, "but I also know this. He has given me more honesty in one evening than most men have offered me in years." "And if that honesty wounds you?" Margaret asked. Eleanor thought of the Duchess's dying request, of Harrogate's stark admission. "Then I will decide for myself whether the wound was worth its cause," she replied. Upstairs in her room, long after her mother and sisters had gone to bed, Eleanor lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Her mind replayed the evening in restless fragments, the cold splendor of Harrogate's carriage, the stunned hush in the Davenport's ballroom, the calculated glint in Lady Verity's eyes, the warmth of Harrogate's hand at her back as they turned in the waltz, and threaded through it all a quieter, more personal shock, the knowledge that the Duchess had noticed her, had remembered her, had spoken her name with urgency in the last hours of her life. It altered something fundamental in Eleanor's understanding of herself. For years, she had carefully accepted the narrative London wrote about her, that she was unremarkable, safely decorous, a woman whose presence made no waves. To discover that beyond the reach of that narrative, in the private heart of Harrogate House, her name had existed in a different script entirely. It was humbling and frightening. Sleep, when it finally came, was filled with disjointed dreams. Dark carriages, blue gowns, children's faces, and a hawk in flight etched in gold. Morning brought no relief from attention. The Whitcomb breakfast table, usually a quiet affair with the rustle of newspapers and the clink of china, was already laden with tension when Eleanor entered. A copy of a popular society paper lay folded beside her father's plate, its pages crinkled from more aggressive handling than they deserved. "Ah, Eleanor," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "You are awake." "Good morning, Papa," she answered, taking her seat. Her father cleared his throat. "It seems," he said, "that your evening was eventful." Margaret, unable to restrain herself, reached for the paper and unfolded it with a flourish. "Listen to this," she said, scanning quickly until she found the relevant passage. "Last night at the much-anticipated Davenport ball, London was shaken from its winter torpor by the re-emergence of that elusive figure, Alexander Hastings, Duke of Harrowgate. If his presence alone was not sufficient to send fans fluttering, his chosen companion certainly was. Lady Eleanor Whitcomb, hitherto more often commended for her composure than courted for her charms, arrived upon his arm and shared with him both the first and last dances of the evening. Whether this signals a thaw in the Duke's long frost, or merely the beginning of a new intriguing winter, remains to be seen." She looked up, eyes bright. "They are calling you intriguing, Nell. You must frame this at once." Her mother made a choked sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob. "Do not jest," she said. "They will call her many things before this is done. Intriguing is merely the opening volley." Her father's expression was darker. "Harrowgate is not a man to attach himself lightly," he said. "Yet he is also not a man whose motives are easily discerned. Eleanor, did he speak of his intentions?" Eleanor considered how much to share. Her father was a good man, but like many good men of his generation, he underestimated the complexity of the world beyond his own sphere. "He spoke," she said carefully, "of wishing to counter some of the stories London has told about him. He believes that by appearing with someone whose reputation is quieter than most, he can redirect those stories." Her father's mouth tightened. "Quieter," he repeated. "Invisible, they mean. Overlooked. Do you understand, Eleanor, that you have been used this way before? Not by dukes, perhaps, but by 100 people who valued your unobtrusiveness more than your person." "Yes," she said, "I understand that very well." "And you consent to it again?" he demanded. Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "No," she said, "I consent to something different. I know I am being seen now. He made very sure of that. Whatever he intends, he has stripped away the comfort of invisibility. I chose to step into that with my eyes open. That is not the same as being used without my consent." He studied her, his frown deepening into something almost like reluctant respect. "You have grown," he said slowly. "I do not know when it happened, but you have." "When you were not looking," she replied gently. The corner of his mouth twitched. "Touché," he said, echoing Hadley's word from the night before. As the morning wore on, more papers arrived. One contained a crude but recognizable cartoon, Harrowgate as a dark, brooding figure, leading a faceless young lady up a staircase labeled "Return to Society." Eleanor's name was scrawled beneath the lady's slippered feet. Another featured a column by an anonymous writer, speculating with barely concealed relish on the Duke's sudden interest in the overlooked middle daughter of a respectable but unremarkable house. "They make it sound as though your unremarkableness is your most remarkable quality," Charlotte observed dryly. "It was," Eleanor said, "until last night." By afternoon, calling cards began to appear. Women who had not visited the Whitcomb house in years suddenly remembered their affection for Eleanor's mother. Men of varying degrees of consequence stopped by on business with your father and made certain they were seen to leave their cards for Eleanor as well. "It is like watching a garden after a storm," Margaret said as she examined the growing stack. "All the creatures that hid are suddenly darting out, eager to see what has changed." "Some of those creatures bite," Charlotte warned. Eleanor did not disagree. The formal invitation to Harrowgate House arrived just before dusk. It was delivered not by a footman, but by a man Eleanor recognized from descriptions. Mr. Finch, Harrowgate's long-serving secretary. He was slight, balding, and possessed of the sort of impeccable posture that suggested a lifetime spent in the background of important events. "Lady Eleanor," he said, bowing, "His Grace asks that I convey his regrets at the necessity for formality after last night's informality, but he assures me it is prudent." "Prudent?" Eleanor echoed. "For your protection," Finch replied, "and his. A written record of your visit, properly timed and framed, leaves less room for malicious invention." It was a sobering thought. That truth itself needed paperwork to defend it. Eleanor accepted the envelope. Inside, the invitation was brief and meticulously worded. It requested the honor of her presence at Harrowgate House in 2 days' time for tea and conversation. It noted correctly that her mother might wish to accompany her, but added in a more personal hand at the bottom, "If you are willing, I ask that you come alone. There are matters I must discuss with you that do not admit an audience on my age." Her mother read the note twice. "I do not like the thought of you there without me," she said. "I know," Eleanor replied. "But if I am to step into this fully, there will be moments when you cannot stand beside me." Her mother's fingers tightened on the paper. "You sound," she murmured, "like someone about to marry." Eleanor's heart skipped. "We are nowhere near that," she said quickly. "He has made no such declaration. If anything, he seems determined to speak to me as an ally, or a confessor, or both." "That may be more dangerous," her mother said. "One knows where one stands as a wife. Confidantes can be discarded when the crisis passes." "Perhaps," Eleanor said, "but I am already in this crisis, whether I choose to name it or not." In the end, her mother agreed, reluctantly, to let her go alone. "On one condition," she said. "Name it," Eleanor replied. "You will not accept anything from him, promise, offer, gift, without bringing it home and looking at it in daylight with those who love you," her mother said. "Men like Harrowgate can make the darkest corners look deceptively safe. I will not have you moving into his shadows without a lantern of your own." Eleanor nodded. "That," she said, "I can promise." 2 days later, a different carriage drew up before the Whitcomb house. Harrowgate had not sent his own this time. Instead, a more modest but still elegant vehicle bearing no crest arrived, driven by a coachman whose livery was deliberately unobtrusive. "Discretion," Finch explained when Eleanor stepped out. "His Grace thought it kinder." "Kinder," Eleanor thought, then delivering her to his door in a blaze of heraldry that would draw every curious gaze along the route. The ride across town felt shorter than the one to the Davenports' ball, though it carried more weight. When the carriage turned onto the street where Harrowgate House stood, Eleanor felt her breath catch. The house was even more imposing by daylight than rumour made it at night. Tall with a severe classical facade, its stone was the pale colour of old paper. The windows were large but shuttered on the upper floors, giving the impression of a face with its eyes half closed, watching but not inviting. As Finch helped her down, Eleanor tilted her head back to take it in fully. "You are not afraid?" he asked quietly. "Yes," she said honestly, "but fear is not always a warning to turn back. Sometimes it is a sign you are finally somewhere that matters." He studied her for a moment, with an expression that on another man might have been called fond. "You will do, I think," he murmured, almost to himself. The great door of Harrowgate House opened before they reached it. Harrowgate himself stood there. He was not in full formal dress today. His coat was still dark, but his cravat was tied more simply. The effect was peculiar, less polished, perhaps, but somehow more real. He seemed taller in his own doorway than he had under the chandeliers, as though the house lent height to his already considerable presence. "Lady Eleanor," he said, bowing, "thank you for coming." "Your Grace," she replied, "thank you for inviting me." He stepped aside to let her enter. She had expected the interior of Harrowgate House to be cold. Instead, it felt hushed. The great entrance hall was beautifully proportioned, its marble floors set in an intricate pattern, its walls hung with paintings whose frames alone looked as though they could pay off a small nation's debt. But there was an absence of the cluttered ostentation found in many grand houses. No excessive displays of plate or porcelain, no unnecessary adornments. It was a house that knew its own worth and saw no need to shout. "Come," he said, "I have ordered tea in the smaller drawing room. We will not be overheard there." As she followed him through a series of corridors, Eleanor caught glimpses of other rooms. A music room, its pianoforte silent, a dustless gleam on its surface. A library, its shelves reaching nearly to the ceiling, a ladder poised partway along as though someone had been interrupted in mid-search. Servants moved with practiced efficiency, their faces composed, their eyes respectfully averted. This was not a house in disarray. For all the stories of Harrowgate's grief and isolation, his household ran like a well-tuned mechanism. The smaller drawing room he led her into was, in fact, not particularly small, simply less grand than the great salons she had pictured. Sunlight filtered in through tall windows, softened by sheer curtains. 2 armchairs were drawn up near the hearth, where a modest fire burned, more for comfort than necessity. A tea tray waited on a low table between the chairs. "Please," he said, gesturing to one of the chairs. "Sit." She did. He took the other. For a moment, the scene felt deceptively domestic. 2 people taking tea in a well-appointed room, the roles of host and guest clearly defined. If not for the thick undercurrent of unspoken history and expectation, it could almost have been ordinary. He poured for her, his movements as deliberate here as they had been on the dance floor. "You spoke of my wife's promise," Eleanor said, once they each held a cup. "Of her wish that you protect me or women like me from being devoured by this city. You implied there is more to that than kindness or sentiment." "There is," he said. He set his cup down without drinking. "Eleanor." "May I call you Eleanor?" he asked. She hesitated, then nodded. "Yes." "Eleanor," he said, and her name in his mouth felt different now, less formal, more personal. "There is a reason my wife believed London could one day turn its teeth on you in particular." His gaze held hers steady, giving her one more chance to flinch. She did not. "Tell me," she said. He leaned back slightly as though aligning his thoughts. "Before I married my wife," he began, "there was another woman with claims upon my attention. Not a mistress," he added quickly, as though he had anticipated the leap of her mind. "A cause." He rose then, crossing to a small writing desk against the wall. From a locked drawer, he drew out a bundle of tied papers. "My wife," he continued as he returned to his seat, "was deeply involved in philanthropic work. The orphanage, the concert, you remember, a number of small schools. She believed that charity without structure was simply a salve for wealthy consciences. She wanted change that would outlast her." He untied the bundle, revealing not just papers but something else, a folded piece of thicker parchment, worn at the edges. In the course of her work, she uncovered irregularities, he said. Funds diverted, properties mismanaged, promises made and broken. At first she believed it was mere incompetence. Then she realized it was theft. He handed her the folded parchment. "Read this," he said. Eleanor unfolded it carefully. It was a letter. The handwriting was fine, elegant, undeniably feminine. "My dear Mr. Whitcomb, I trust this letter finds you in good health. However, I must confess myself troubled by the accounts most recently sent to me regarding the properties under your firm's stewardship." Eleanor's vision blurred for a second. She blinked hard and kept reading. "As you are aware, the funds in question were earmarked for the maintenance and improvement of certain institutions in St. Giles. Yet the sums withdrawn bear no resemblance to the modest expenditures reported. I cannot reconcile these figures. I must therefore request firmly but respectfully a full accounting—" "The signature," Harrowgate said softly. "Look at the signature." Eleanor's hand trembled as she turned to the bottom of the letter. Elizabeth Hastings, Duchess of Harrowgate. The world tilted again. "My father," she whispered. "Yes," Harrowgate said. "Your father's firm managed a number of investments on behalf of my wife. When she began to suspect mismanagement, she wrote to him. This," he gestured to the letter, "is the mildest of her communications." Eleanor's heart pounded. "He never told us," she said. "He never said—" "Of course he did not," Harrowgate said. "He believed he had resolved the matter discreetly. And in some respects he did. The missing funds were eventually restored, but only after my wife pressed far harder than a woman in her position should have needed to press. Eleanor felt cold all over. "Are you saying my father stole from your wife?" she asked. "I am saying," Harrogate replied, "that someone in his firm did. Whether he knew in full at the time, I cannot swear. But he knew enough to be afraid when my wife refused to let the matter go." He watched the cascade of emotions across her face with an expression that was almost gentle. "You are not responsible for his choices," he said quietly. "No," she said, "but I am shaped by them." He nodded once as if she had confirmed a private assessment. "When my wife realized the scale of the irregularities," he continued, "she began to suspect a larger scheme, multiple charities, multiple estates, all funneled through a handful of firms, your father's among them." "Did she confront him?" Eleanor asked, her throat tight. "She requested meetings," Harrogate said, "wrote letters such as the one you hold. She spoke to people in government, in society. Some dismissed her as meddlesome. Some listened. A few, the ones with the most to lose, began to take an interest in shutting her up." He paused, his gaze turning for a moment inward. "On the night she died," he said, "she told me 3 things. The name of the orphanage she feared would be closed if she failed, the names of the men she believed most responsible for the thefts, and your name." Eleanor clutched the letter tighter. "Mine," she said. "Yes, not because you were implicated. On the contrary, because you were connected to the man whose firm sat at a key point in the scheme, and because you, more than your sisters, possessed the temperament my wife believed would either be crushed by such knowledge or transformed by it." "I do not understand," Eleanor said, fighting to keep her voice level. "I barely knew her. She met us twice. How could she—" "My wife noticed what others did not," he said simply. "She saw that your sisters moved through the world as though it would bend for them. You moved through it as though you expected to accommodate it. And yet, when pressed, you resisted in small, stubborn ways. She believed that if the truth about your father's firm ever became public, you would be the one to demand it be faced honestly, and that for that reason you would become a target." "A target," Eleanor repeated numbly. "For anyone who wished to keep the scheme quiet," he said, "discrediting you, binding you to a man whose reputation could be used to overshadow such questions, or simply marrying you off to someone far removed from all of it. Any of these would serve. My wife feared that if she failed to expose the full scale of the thefts before her death, the next best option was to ensure that you, of all people, did not become collateral damage when the reckoning came." Eleanor sat very still. "In the years since her death," Harrogate said, "I have uncovered more of what she suspected. I have seen men fall quietly, not in the public eye, but behind the scenes, forced to sell properties, compelled to resign from positions, all while the public is told some bland story about health or family concerns. Your father was not among the worst, but he was vulnerable." "My father is an honest man," Eleanor said, though the letter in her hands trembled. "He may have been careless. He may have trusted the wrong people, but he is not. He is not a villain in a melodrama." "No," Harrogate agreed. "He is not. Which is part of why I am speaking to you now. The true villains would not hesitate to sacrifice him if it served their purposes. And they would not hesitate to use you as leverage to ensure his silence, should it ever be necessary." She met his gaze, understanding now with a sickening clarity. "And so," she said slowly, "you brought me to that ball. You placed me at your side. You made it impossible for them to move against me without drawing the eyes of the whole city." "Exactly," he said. She laughed then, a short, incredulous sound. "So I am your shield after all." His jaw tightened. "No," he said. "You are the one my wife asked me to protect, even when I did not wish to protect anyone ever again. The shield is my reputation. They know that touching you now is to touch me. I am the barrier. You are the point." "The point," she repeated. "Yes," he said, "the point at which their schemes intersect with my patience, the point at which the quiet woman they discounted becomes the one person who can pierce their pretense." Her head spun. "And what?" she asked. "Do you expect me to do with this knowledge? Confront my father? March into drawing rooms and denounce men whose names I do not even know?" "No," he said. "Not yet. Perhaps not ever in that melodramatic fashion your sister would enjoy. What I expect, what I hope, is that you will understand why your life has suddenly become of interest to people who never looked at you twice before, and that you will let me stand between you and the worst of what they might attempt." The room felt smaller, the fire's warmth suddenly suffocating. "You have had years to learn this," Eleanor said, "to adjust to it. I have had an evening and an afternoon." "I know," he said quietly. "It is unfair." "Yes," she agreed. "It is." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of all that had been said settling around them like heavy drapery. At last, she asked the question that had been coiled beneath all the others. "And if I refuse," she said, "if I choose to step back from this, to retreat into the quiet life London once offered me, what then?" He looked at her with an intensity that almost frightened her. "Then," he said, "I will find another way to keep my promise. But I will do so with the knowledge that I failed to convince the one person my wife believed would understand what was at stake." Guilt pricked, but so did anger. "You ask a great deal," she said. "Yes," he replied. "I do." "I ask, yes," he replied. "I do. I ask you to let me use your name and presence as part of a game you did not choose to play. I ask you to trust that my vow to my wife will not lead me to sacrifice you, as she herself was sacrificed by those she attempted to expose. I ask you to step out of the life you thought you knew and into one in which very little will ever again be simple." "And in return," she pressed, "what do you offer, Your Grace, besides protection and scandal?" For the first time since she had entered the house, something like a genuine smile flickered at the edges of his mouth. "In return," he said slowly, "I offer you the chance to be seen, not as a safe choice, not as a spare daughter, not as an ornament at the edge of a ballroom, but as a woman capable of altering the course of more than her own life. I offer you honesty, even when it is painful. And," he added more quietly, "I offer you my respect, which, for a man who has not had much use for anyone in 4 years, is no small thing." The rawness of that last admission landed with more force than any declaration of love could have, at least for now. Eleanor looked down at the letter in her hands, the neat script, the measured anger between the lines. She imagined the Duchess writing it, perhaps late at night, perhaps with the knowledge that time was running out. "My wife believed," Harrogate said softly, "that a silent woman is never truly invisible, only underestimated. She saw that in you. I see it as well." "And you?" she asked, lifting her gaze to his. "You are a silent man. Are you at peace?" A shadow crossed his face. "Rarely," he said. "Silence, in my case, has been less about peace and more about planning." "Planning what?" He held her gaze, his answer simple and precise. "My next move." Outside, unnoticed by those within, a carriage pulled up to Harrogate House. A man stepped out, handsome, impeccably dressed, with the easy confidence of one born to privilege and the wary eyes of someone who knows how quickly privilege can be lost. He handed his hat and coat to the footman at the door with a smile, but there was no warmth in it. "Inform His Grace," he said, "that Lord Carroway is here to offer his congratulations on his return to society." Upstairs, in the quiet drawing room, Eleanor had never heard the name. She would. Soon. And when she did, she would understand that Harrogate's next move had just drawn out an opponent far more dangerous than gossiping matrons or greedy solicitors, a man who had everything to lose if the full truth of what the Duchess died trying to expose ever came to light. But for the moment all she knew was this: her life no longer belonged to the comfortable, predictable script London had written for her. It belonged to a story in which promises made at deathbeds, letters hidden in drawers, and the stubborn courage of underestimated women would decide not only her own fate, but the shape of the scandal London was about to choke on. There are moments when the world narrows to a single choice. For Eleanor Whitcomb, standing in the drawing room of Harrogate House with the Duchess's letter still clutched in her hand, That moment had arrived with the soft knock at the door. Harrowgate's expression shifted instantly. Not fear, but the controlled readiness of a man who had anticipated interference and prepared for it. "Enter," he said. The door opened to reveal Finch, his usually composed face tight with concern. "Your Grace," he said quietly, "Lord Carroway has arrived. He insists on seeing you. He claims it is a matter of some urgency." Eleanor watched Harrowgate's jaw tighten. "Carroway," he repeated, as though tasting something bitter. He turned to Eleanor. "The man my wife suspected most, the one whose name appears in nearly every irregular transaction she documented." Eleanor's pulse quickened. "He is here now?" she asked. "Yes," Harrowgate said, "and he would not come unless he believed he had leverage." He stood, his movements deliberate, controlled. "You may leave through the side entrance if you wish," he said to Eleanor. "Finch will escort you. Carroway need never know you were here." It would have been easy, safe. The old Eleanor, the one who had spent years accommodating the world's expectations, would have taken that escape without hesitation. But the letter in her hand reminded her of a woman who had refused to be silent, even when silence would have been easier, even when it might have saved her life. "No," Eleanor said, rising to her feet. "I will stay." Harrowgate studied her face. "He is dangerous," he warned, "not with weapons, but with words. He will twist whatever he sees here into something that serves his purposes." "Then let him try," Eleanor replied. "I am tired of being protected from the truth of my own life." Something like admiration flickered in his eyes. "Very well," he said, "but follow my lead. Carroway is a man who mistakes silence for weakness. Do not give him more than he has earned." Finch departed, and moments later, Lord Carroway entered. He was younger than Eleanor had expected, perhaps 35, with fair hair and a face that might have been called handsome, if not for the calculating coldness in his pale blue eyes. He moved with the ease of a man accustomed to being welcome everywhere. "Harrowgate," he said, bowing. "How good of you to receive me on such short notice." His gaze slid past the Duke to Eleanor, and she saw the flash of recognition, the swift recalculation. "And Lady Eleanor Whitcomb," he continued smoothly. "What a delightful surprise. I had heard rumors of your association with His Grace, but I confess I thought them exaggerated. London does so love its melodrama." "Lord Carroway," Eleanor said, curtsying with just enough politeness to avoid rudeness. "To what do I owe this visit?" Harrowgate asked, his tone flat. Carroway settled into a chair uninvited, crossing one leg over the other with studied casualness. "I came to offer congratulations," he said. "Your return to society has been the talk of every drawing room, and your choice of companion," he glanced at Eleanor, "so unexpected, so pointed." "I require neither congratulations nor commentary on my choices," Harrowgate said. "Of course not," Carroway agreed, "but I thought it only fair to warn you, out of concern for an old acquaintance, that certain names are being whispered alongside yours. Names connected to old investigations. Old scandals that some believed buried with your late wife." The threat hung in the air, thinly veiled. Eleanor felt her hands tighten on the letter she still held, hidden in the folds of her skirt. "My wife," Harrowgate said quietly, "died pursuing justice. If her work troubles you, Lord Carroway, perhaps you should examine why." Carroway's smile did not waver, but his eyes hardened. "Justice is such an inconvenient word," he said. "It implies absolutes. But we both know the world is more complicated than that. Men make mistakes, firms mismanage funds, ledgers become confused. None of this requires melodrama or accusations of villainy." "Unless," Eleanor said suddenly, surprising even herself. The confusion was deliberate. Both men turned to her. Carroway's expression remained pleasant, but something predatory moved beneath it. "Lady Eleanor," he said, "you speak as though you have some knowledge of these matters. I wonder where a young woman of your sheltered upbringing might have acquired such certainty." She met his gaze without flinching. "From a letter," she said, "written by a woman who refused to be silenced by men who thought her inconvenient." She drew the Duchess's letter from her skirt and held it up. Carroway's composure cracked, just slightly, just enough. "That," he said carefully, is a private correspondence. It has no bearing on anything. It has every bearing, Harrogate said. It names you, Carraway. Not explicitly, perhaps, but any man with access to the records my wife kept would see your fingerprints on every missing pound. Carraway stood abruptly. You have no proof, he said. Only the paranoid scribblings of a woman whose illness clearly affected her judgment. Eleanor's anger flared, hot and sudden. She was not mad, she said sharply. She was right, and you are here because you fear what will happen if the world believes her. For a long moment, silence held the room. Then Carraway laughed, a cold, humorless sound. Believe what you wish, he said. But consider this. Lady Eleanor's father managed funds for the same institutions. If accusations begin to fly, whose name will be dragged through the scandal first? A duke's, or a middling solicitor with no title to protect him? The threat was clear now, undisguised. Eleanor felt the ground shift beneath her, but she refused to let it show. My father made mistakes, she said. But he was not the architect of theft, you were. Carraway's eyes narrowed. Prove it, he said softly. Bring your letters and your righteous anger into a courtroom and see how far they carry you. Or, he added, his tone lightening, accept that the past is best left buried and turn your attention to more pleasant matters. His Grace's interest in you, for instance. I am certain it is entirely honourable. The insinuation stung, but Eleanor did not rise to it. I'm certain, she said, that whatever His Grace's reasons for bringing me into this, they are more honest than anything you have offered in years. Harrogate moved then, stepping between Eleanor and Carraway with the quiet menace of a man who had reached the limit of his patience. You have made your position clear, Carraway, he said. Now hear mine. I will not allow my wife's work to be dismissed as the ravings of an ill woman. I will not allow men like you to threaten those I have sworn to protect, and I will not allow you to remain in my house a moment longer. Carraway's face flushed. You are making a mistake, he said. No, Harrogate replied. You made the mistake 4 years ago when you underestimated a duchess. Do not compound it by underestimating me or her. He gestured toward Eleanor. Leave, Harrogate said. Now. For a heartbeat, Carraway looked as though he might argue. Then, with a curt nod, he turned and strode from the room. The door closed behind him with a sharp click. Eleanor exhaled, the tension draining from her shoulders. He will retaliate, she said. Yes, Harrogate agreed, but he will do so carefully. He knows that any move against you now draws attention he cannot afford, and that attention will inevitably lead back to him. He turned to her, his expression softening. You were brave, he said. Foolish, perhaps, but brave. I was angry, she corrected. Your wife deserved better than to have her memory dismissed by a man like him. She did, he said quietly. And so do you. Eleanor looked at him, truly looked, and saw not the distant, grieving Duke of London's rumours, but a man who had carried the weight of a promise for 4 years and was only now beginning to set it down. What happens now? She asked. Now, he said, we finish what she started. Quietly, carefully, but thoroughly. Carraway will make mistakes. Men like him always do when they are cornered, and when he does, we will be ready. We, Eleanor repeated. He smiled then, a real smile, small but genuine. Yes, he said, if you are willing. She thought of her father, of the scandal that might still touch her family. She thought of her sisters, of London's gossip, of the life she had thought she would live, and then she thought of the Duchess in her blue gown, listening as though every note mattered. I am willing, Eleanor said. In the weeks that followed, London discovered that Eleanor Whitcomb was not, after all, a woman content to ornament the edges of society. She appeared at Harrogate's side at political dinners, charity events, and even a session of Parliament, where the Duke spoke on reforms to institutional oversight. Her presence was noted, her composure admired, her sudden, inexplicable importance analysed endlessly in drawing rooms and gossip columns. Carraway attempted once to spread rumours about impropriety. They died almost as quickly as they were born, not because Eleanor's reputation was spotless, though it was, but because Harrogate made it quietly known that any man who slandered her would answer to him personally. Eleanor's father, when confronted with the truth of his firm's entanglement, wept. But he also cooperated, providing documents that filled in gaps the Duchess had not lived to complete. He was not prosecuted. His role had been negligence, not malice, but he resigned from his position and devoted the remainder of his career to pro bono work for the very institutions he had once failed. Charlotte and Margaret watched their sister's transformation with a mixture of awe and bemusement. "You have become someone we do not quite recognize," Charlotte said one afternoon. "Good," Eleanor replied. "I was tired of being the version of myself that everyone found so easy to overlook." As for Harrogate, he and Eleanor did not marry quickly. London expected it, demanded it, speculated endlessly about when the engagement would be announced, but they took their time. They spent months in conversation, in shared work, in the slow building of trust that comes not from grand gestures, but from showing up day after day and choosing honesty over convenience. When he finally asked her, it was not in a ballroom or under the eyes of society. It was in the small drawing room where he had first shown her the Duchess's letter, with the fire burning low and the late afternoon light slanting through the windows. "I have kept my promise to my wife," he said, "but I find I would like to make a new one. To you." Eleanor's heart, which had learned to be cautious, opened. "What sort of promise?" she asked. "The sort," he said, "that involves spending the rest of my life ensuring you are never again underestimated, least of all by yourself." She smiled. "That," she said, "is a promise I will hold you to." They were married in the spring. London called it the most unexpected match of the decade. Some said he had chosen her out of duty to his late wife's memory. Others whispered about strategy and alliances and the careful management of scandal. Eleanor did not care what they said. She knew the truth, that a woman who had once been invisible had become the center of a story that changed not only her life, but the lives of those who had dared to underestimate her. And in the end, that was enough. Thank you so much for joining us on Eleanor and Alexander's journey. If you enjoyed this story of resilience, hidden courage, and unexpected love, we would be so grateful if you could take a moment to subscribe to our channel, leave a comment sharing your favorite moment, and hit that like button. And don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss our next tale of romance and intrigue. Your support means the world to us, and we can't wait to share more stories with you soon. Until next time, dear listeners.